The theatre style I have decided to talk about is Kabuki. Kabuki developed prior to the Western influence in 1868, parallel to No and Doll theatre, as seen here. Kabuki utilised men in the role of women to appeal to non-aristocratic audiences, much like No theatre, as shown in the PowerPoint. It also took influence from No and Doll theatre by utilising their plays and themes in their plays. However, this desperation to survive in the theatrical world led to a lot of people thinking it lacked precise dramatic form, as well as being irregular, racy, violent, and at times sensational and cheap. Taken from the Kabuki Theatre by L. Ernst. The first performance of Kabuki was in Kyoto in 1596. However, it was during the Edo period, spanning from the dates of 1603 to 1868, during which Kabuki really developed its own style. This was due to the multiple civil wars and government unrest during Japan at the time. This meant that people weren't allowed to enter into Japan, as well as this there is segregation within different areas of the country. This isolation meant that creativity thrived within the different areas of Japan. For example, the Kabuki of Kamigata reflected the influence of the quiet imperial court. However, the Edo Kabuki paralleled the harsh realities of a young, audacious city. During this time, it also meant that different types of Kabuki reflecting the different areas had different names. For example, arigato reflected the rough business, again paralleling the Edo period. This reflects to the nature of the movements of Kabuki. For example, in wagato, it was more a floating, smooth movement compared to arigato, which was a lot harder and faster movements. During this time of segregation was a continuous theme within Japan. For example, actors were also segregated from others, since they were seen as being overly influential and threatening to collapse the social order. This meant that actors were banned from leaving their area and also banned from leaving the country. As well as this, they were penalised for having dinner or staying the night at a friend's house who wasn't also an actor. The hierarchical state of Japan at the time also led to the development of Kabuki. This was since anything below a townsman or farmer was seen as the lowest social class, and at this time it was actors. However, ironically, Kabuki soon developed to be the theatre of the townsman, since it reflected their artistical tastes and ethical beliefs. And by the end of the 18th century, it was described as the definite cultural form of the townsman. So culturally, Kabuki was a manifestation of perplexing social class, economic strength and social position. However, despite this mixing of cultures, on the 23rd of October 1629, women's Kabuki, known as Ono Kabuki, was banned until 1868. So in conclusion, Kabuki has formed from its suspicious beginning due to the fact it uses actors instead of dolls, as well as the fact it appeals to the lower class. It meant that a lot of aristocratic audiences didn't appreciate it as a form of theatre. So how does the performance work? Plays in Kabuki were often characterised depending on their subject matter rather than the genre, and Danjiro VII, who was one of the best Kabuki actors at the time, wrote the 18 best Kabuki plays. This included The Subscription List, The Arrow Maker, Sukuroku and Just a Moment. As well as this, Kabuki took influence from dance styles such as bukaku, as well as arigato, linking back to the harsh development of arigato as a style of Kabuki. So these plays addressed historical events and moral conflicts of the heart, and Nakamura Kichizo, who wrote a work on the Kabuki playwrights, described the plays as not fit for analysis apart from the technique of acting them on stage, referring back to the idea that the plays weren't really the subject matter of Kabuki, but instead people came to see the actors and the technique of the actors on stage. Costume and makeup also played an important part in Kabuki, and their kimonos that they wore often weighed 50 to 60 pounds and had multiple layers. These also included a partial change of costume, during which the obi or the belt would hold the top part of, the bottom part of the kimono in place, and the top part would be ripped down by stagehands to reveal a different colour or pattern, showing a change in emotion or a change in the actor's feelings. As well as this, the makeup was pure white for men, women and children, unless it was arigato, which is the harsh form of kabuki, since then they would include red paint to show tense muscles and veins in the arms and face. The stage at the time was often around 80 feet wide. However, by the 18th century it's barely 50% of this size, showing the change in kabuki and how it's developed throughout time. As well as this, there was not much scenery, again referring to the idea that it was more about the actors rather than the plays that they were performing. And on the floor there was these low wooden partitions where families would go and sit for an entire day to watch the plays, and they'd bring food and snacks since it was seen as a big event in Japan. So the area of kabuki, that I've decided to focus on is the mie. This again refers back to the harsh form of arigato as a type of kabuki, since the mie was the ultimate form of physical expression, and it was basically a pose that actors would do to emphasise a specific emotion or to establish themselves as a character on stage. So the mie is described as freezing in a climactic moment. So the actor would build up to this moment and then strike a pose to show their emotion or to establish themselves as a character. And as the mie would come up, the audience would shout "Mate imashita," which would mean "we've been waiting for this," showing the relevance of the mie within kabuki as a theatre form. So the mie would replicate Buddhist gods, and some of its key features were antagonistic muscles, a defensive attitude. The actor would also cross their eyes in a single direction to intensify what they were staring at. As well as this, they would also draw down the corners of their mouths to express their emotion. So the mie was a pose used when a character has conquered an enemy, or they were making an entrance. One example of the mie is stone throwing. This was when the actor would raise their right arm above their head with tense long fingers, and their left hand would be on the sword hilt or fan, and they would pose in the mie in this position for a few seconds to establish how they were feeling. Other examples include around a pillar and genroku. Female characters didn't perform the mie, however they performed their own version of it known as the kimari. So my specific moment of theatre is taken from the stone-cutting feat of Jawara, during which Jawara raises his sword above his head in order to test the strength of it. He then brings it down on two bodies which were laid in front of him with a loud cry. And as he lifts up the sword above his head, he poses in the mie, which should look like this, and then he brings it down onto the two bodies. However, as we can see from this slide, I began with a different sense of what a mie was, since I had a lack of facial expressions, bent arms and a limp body movement, which meant that I wasn't really conveying the strength of the mie, particularly due to the fact that it was an arigato style mie, which involves harsher movements and more strong features. Referring back to arigato, arigato kabuki usually utilised characters who were bold, handsome and idealised warriors who would usually carry huge swords, and I think this is relevant to the section that I am going to portray in my chosen moment of theatre. So as I stated previously, Jawara raised the sword above his head, behind his shoulder, strike the mie, and then brought it down on the two bodies in front of him, which should look something like this. So as we can see, I developed from these limp movements in the previous slide, having a much stronger arm movement and a louder cry as I brought down the sword in order to emphasise the fact that my character was a warrior. I also used my facial expressions by crossing my eyes, drawing down the corners of my mouth and staring at one specific point in order to emphasise the emotion I was feeling at the time and build the tension in the scene to bring a moment of heightened emotion, which was the point of the mie. So as an actor, I feel as though this has developed me since I've now realised that I need to bring tension into every single part of my body. Whereas before I felt as though I'd focus on maybe my arms or my face to express emotion, now I realise that I can utilise my entire body in order to do this. As well as this, I feel as though I can apply this skill to other performances, particularly due to the fact that the mie focuses on one specific emotion at one time. I think this is important to express to the audience how I'm feeling at one point. Furthermore, I've seen how Japanese plays differ from those of the Western world due to the fact that they rely a lot less on dialogue. For example, Kabuki is much more focused on movement, sound, facial expressions and the body rather than what actors are saying to one another to convey relationships and emotions. So I've also learnt about the history of Japan, which incorporates isolation quite heavily and how isolation leads to creativity. I think I can utilise this idea in my other subjects such as film due to the fact that I've seen that now if you're isolated from outside influences, it brings your creativity from other elements such as emotion or politics. As well as this, I can bring this idea into my discussions within talk, since I feel as though it's part of human nature to use creative outlets to express emotions, particularly when you're isolated from any other kind of influence. And I can bring this within my discussions of the creative arts and industries. So I can compare this theatre style to the theatre styles of commedia dell'arte as well as melodrama, due to the fact that both of these use heightened moments of heightened emotion to convey characters, as well as the fact that they're over-stylized and use exaggerated facial expressions to convey emotions. Particularly in melodrama, we can see that the character here is trying to convey a moment of terror due to the fact that their weight is only on one leg and they're not in a neutral stance. As well as this, they're moving their arms from their shoulder rather than their elbow and covering their face to exemplify this idea of terror. Therefore, we can see from these explicit rules to show an emotion that this is a lot like the mie, that they want to have one moment of heightened emotion to particularly express a character in the way they're feeling. Therefore, we can see that there are detailed rules for both melodrama, commedia dell'arte and kabuki, particularly referring back to my chosen moment of theatre, which utilised the mie to express emotions and character traits. Thank you.